Sometimes loneliness becomes so heavy that even the proudest hearts will reach for the most unlikely hand. In 1885 Wyoming, two souls carrying decades of quiet pain would find each other in the most unexpected way. Eleanor Whitmore was a widowed schoolteacher with an empty house, and Cole was a cowboy who couldn't read his own name. When drought threatened everything, she made him an offer that shocked their small town: marriage for literacy lessons. What started as a practical arrangement became something neither expected. As Eleanor taught Cole to read by lamplight, they slowly began to heal each other's wounded hearts. But when Cole's estranged son arrives with devastating news, their fragile new beginning faces its greatest test. Can love really grow from such unlikely soil? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty main street of Clearwater, Wyoming territory, as Eleanor Whitmore stepped onto her front porch with a cup of coffee that had grown cold in her hands. She stood there every morning at precisely 7 o'clock, watching the town wake up around her, the same ritual she'd maintained for the 3 years since her husband's death. Her teaching slate hung by the door, worn smooth from countless lessons with the local children, a testament to her unwavering belief that education could lift even the humblest soul. At 52, Eleanor possessed the kind of quiet dignity that commanded respect without demanding attention. Her auburn hair, now threaded with silver, was always pinned back in a practical chignon, and her dresses were well made but simple, the wardrobe of a woman who valued substance over style. The house behind her, inherited from her late husband's family, stood as one of the finer homes in Clearwater, with its wraparound porch and 2 stories of solid timber construction. Yet for all its comfort, it felt hollow, echoing with memories of laughter that had died with the influenza that took her husband. She sipped her coffee and watched the familiar figures moving through their morning routines. Mrs. Henderson hung laundry on the line behind the general store, her movements sharp with the efficiency of a woman who'd raised 6 children. Young Billy Morrison led his father's cattle down the street toward the watering hole at the edge of town, the animals kicking up dust that would settle on everything by midday. And there, walking slowly toward the livery stable, was the man who had occupied her thoughts more frequently than she cared to admit. Cole Garrett moved with the deliberate gait of someone who had learned to conserve energy for the long haul. At 54, he carried himself with a straightness that spoke of military training, though his shoulders bore the slight stoop of a man who had spent decades in the saddle. His hair, once golden, had faded to the color of wheat stubble, and his face bore the deep lines carved by sun, wind, and years of squinting at distant horizons. He wore his clothes the way most cowboys did, as tools rather than decoration, yet there was something about his careful attention to cleanliness and order that set him apart from the usual drifters who passed through town. Eleanor knew his story, as most people in Clearwater did. Cole had served in the Union cavalry during the war, coming home to find a different world than the one he'd left. He'd built a small ranch north of town, married a local girl, and had a son. But the harsh winters and drought summers of the territory had worn him down, and when his wife died of consumption, the ranch had fallen into debt. His son, Thomas, had left for the cities back east, bitter about his father's decision to fight in what he considered a rich man's war. Now Cole worked for Sam Peterson at the livery, earning enough to rent a small room above the stable and maintain his dignity, but little more. What most people didn't know, what Eleanor had discovered quite by accident, was that Cole couldn't read. She'd noticed it first when she'd seen him at the general store, pointing to items instead of reading the labels, counting out his money carefully while Mrs. Henderson read him the prices. She'd observed how he held letters from his son unopened for days before finally asking Sam to read them to him, the shame evident in the set of his shoulders. The revelation had stirred something in Eleanor that she hadn't felt since her teaching days before marriage. She had always believed that literacy was the great equalizer, the gift that could transform any life. In her younger years, she had taught reading to former slaves and immigrants, watching illiterate adults blossom as they discovered the world of written words. Cole's situation presented both a challenge and an opportunity, if only she could find a way to approach him without wounding his pride. The drought that had gripped the territory for the past 2 years had changed everyone's calculations about survival. Wells were running dry, crops were failing, and the careful social order of frontier life was beginning to fray at the edges. Eleanor had watched neighbors become desperate, good people making choices they never would have considered in better times. She herself was not immune to the pressures. Though her late husband's investments had left her comfortable, she wasn't wealthy, and the failing harvests on her small farm were beginning to eat into her savings. It was during one of these morning vigils that the idea had first taken shape in her mind. She'd been watching Cole water his horse at her. Well, she'd given permission to anyone in town to use it, as others ran dry when the thought struck her with startling clarity. Here was a man who needed education, and here was a woman who needed companionship and help with the increasing demands of maintaining property in drought conditions. It was a practical solution to mutual problems, nothing more. At least, that's what she told herself as she began to plan her approach. Eleanor's days followed a pattern that had become both comfort and cage. 3 mornings a week, she taught the children of Clearwater in the small schoolhouse at the end of Main Street. The building, barely more than a large cabin with windows, held 15 students on good days fewer, when families needed children to help with farm work or when parents couldn't spare the penny a day for education. She loved those hours, watching young minds grapple with letters and numbers, seeing the moment when reading suddenly made sense to a struggling child. The afternoons were spent managing her property, a modest house with 2 acres that included a vegetable garden, a small orchard, and a chicken coop. Her late husband, Richard, had been a careful planner, and the property was designed to be largely self-sufficient. But drought had withered the garden, the fruit trees were struggling, and even the chickens seemed listless in the heat. What had once been manageable for a woman alone was becoming a daily challenge. Evenings were the hardest. That's when the silence of the house pressed in around her, when she found herself talking to Richard's photograph on the mantelpiece just to hear a human voice. She would sit by the oil lamp, reading books from the small library. Richard had collected novels by Dickens and Austen, volumes of poetry, treatises on philosophy and science. But even her beloved books couldn't entirely fill the void left by human companionship. She had received 3 marriage proposals since Richard's death, all from respectable men seeking either her property or the comfort of an educated wife. Each proposal had been politely declined. She had loved Richard deeply, and the idea of marrying for anything less than genuine affection felt like a betrayal of that memory. Yet, as the months passed and the loneliness deepened, she began to question whether her romantic ideals were a luxury she could afford. Cole's situation was more precarious than most people realized. Sam Peterson was a fair employer, but the livery business was suffering like everything else in the drought. Fewer travelers meant fewer horses to board and shoe. Sam had already reduced Cole's wages once, and there were rumors he might have to let someone go before winter. At 54, Cole was too old to easily find work on the large ranches, and too proud to accept charity. Eleanor had observed him carefully over the past months, noting the quiet dignity with which he handled his reduced circumstances. He was always respectful to the townspeople, helpful to anyone who needed an extra hand, and gentle with the animals in his care. She'd watched him spend his own meager earnings on oats for a stranger's sick horse, and she'd seen him give his lunch to a hungry child whose family was struggling. There was a fundamental decency about Cole Garrett that no amount of hardship seemed able to erode. The more she thought about her idea, the more sensible it seemed. Cole needed security, and status marriage to a property-owning woman would provide both. Eleanor needed help with the physical demands of maintaining her homestead and, if she was honest with herself, companionship to ease the crushing loneliness of her days. And Cole's illiteracy presented an opportunity for her to return to what she loved most, teaching someone to read. It would be a business arrangement, nothing more. They were both too old and too practical for romantic foolishness. They could offer each other mutual support and respect, creating a partnership that would benefit them both without the complications of passion or deep emotional entanglement. It was a solution that made perfect sense. The question was how to propose such an arrangement without insulting Cole's pride or shocking the sensibilities of the town. Clearwater was a small place where gossip traveled faster than wildfire, and any misstep could ruin both their reputations. Eleanor spent several sleepless nights working out exactly how she would approach Cole, what words she would use, how she would frame the proposal to make it seem mutually beneficial rather than charitable. On a particularly hot Tuesday morning in July, as she watched Cole leading a customer's horse to the water trough, Eleanor made her decision. She had taught herself to read when she was barely 5 years old, had earned a teaching certificate when most women couldn't even vote, and had managed to maintain her independence and dignity through 3 years of widowhood. Surely she could find the courage to make one practical proposal to a man who needed exactly what she could offer. She waited until late afternoon when the worst heat of the day had passed, and Cole would be finishing his work at the stable. Then she walked to her well, drew up a bucket of the cool, clear water that was becoming increasingly precious, and waited for him to appear. When Cole arrived with his tired mare, Eleanor was ready. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but her voice was steady as she called out to him. "Mr. Garrett, might I have a word with you?" Cole looked up, surprised. In the 3 years she'd been widowed, they had exchanged perhaps a dozen words, total polite greetings, nothing more. He touched his hat respectfully and walked over to where she stood by the well. "Yes, ma'am?" Eleanor took a deep breath. Everything she had planned to say seemed to desert her in that moment, leaving her with only the simple truth. "I have a proposition for you, Mr. Garrett, one that might benefit us both." Cole's weathered hand stilled on his mare's reins. The afternoon sun cast Eleanor's shadow long across the dusty ground between them, and for a moment neither spoke. His worn Bible, carried in his shirt pocket since his mother's death 20 years ago, seemed to press against his chest like a reminder of all the words he'd never been able to read within its leather-bound pages. "A proposition, ma'am?" His voice carried the careful neutrality of a man who had learned to expect very little from life. Eleanor straightened her shoulders and met his gaze directly. "Mr. Garrett, I believe we find ourselves in similar circumstances. You need security, and I need companionship and assistance with my property. I propose we enter into a marriage arrangement, a practical partnership that would benefit us both." Cole's eyes widened slightly, but he didn't step back. Years of military service and frontier life had taught him to process unexpected information without showing shock. "I'm not sure I follow your meaning, Mrs. Whitmore." "I know you can't read, Mr. Garrett." Eleanor's voice was gentle but direct. "I'm a teacher. In exchange for marriage and the security it would provide you, I would teach you to read and write. We would maintain separate living arrangements within my house, present ourselves as a respectable married couple to the community, and help each other through these difficult times." The silence stretched between them like a held breath. Cole's mare snorted softly and shifted her weight, the only sound in the still afternoon air. Eleanor watched emotions flicker across Cole's face: surprise, embarrassment, consideration, and something that might have been hope. "You do that?" he asked, finally. "Teach me to read?" "I would. It's what I love most about teaching, watching someone discover the world of written words. You're never too old to learn, Mr. Garrett." Cole was quiet for a long moment, his calloused fingers working the leather reins. When he looked up again, his eyes held a vulnerability that made Eleanor's heart tighten unexpectedly. "What would people say? A woman like you, with property and education, marrying a broken-down cowboy. People will say what they will regardless, but a widow who remarries for practical reasons is hardly scandalous. And you're hardly broken down, Mr. Garrett. You're a man of integrity who's faced hard times with dignity. Cole studied her face, as if trying to read the truth there. And you'd want nothing else from me, no. Other expectations. Eleanor felt heat rise in her cheeks, but kept her voice steady. This would be a partnership of mutual benefit, nothing more. We would each maintain our privacy and independence within the arrangement. When would you want an answer? Take whatever time you need to consider it properly. Cole nodded slowly. Might I ask, what brought you to this decision, ma'am? Eleanor considered her words carefully. Loneliness is a luxury neither of us can afford anymore, Mr. Garrett. This drought has changed everything for everyone. I believe we could help each other weather it. That evening, Cole sat in his small room above the livery stable, staring at the unopened letter from his son Thomas that had arrived 2 weeks ago. The letter lay on his rough wooden table like an accusation, its careful script as foreign to him as ancient Greek. Sam Peterson had offered to read it, as he always did, but Cole's pride had prevented him from accepting. Now, Eleanor Whitmore's words echoed in his mind, "You're never too old to learn." He thought about his mother, who had carried that Bible everywhere and read to him every night until her death. She had tried to teach him letters, but farm work and then the war had intervened. By the time he'd returned from the conflict, he'd convinced himself it was too late, that a man his age couldn't learn what children mastered so easily. But what if Eleanor was right? What if he could finally read Thomas's letters himself, could write responses in his own hand instead of dictating them to Sam? The possibility filled him with a longing so sharp it was almost painful. The next morning, Cole found Eleanor in her garden, trying to coax life from drought-withered tomato plants. She looked up as his shadow fell across her work, and he noticed the hope she tried to hide in her expression. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, removing his hat, "I accept your proposition." Eleanor's smile was the first genuinely happy expression he'd seen on her face in the 3 years since her husband's death. "I'm very glad, Mr. Garrett. When would you like to arrange the ceremony?" "As soon as you think proper, ma'am." "There's one more thing," Eleanor said, brushing dirt from her hands. "I think we should be honest with each other from the start. I know this isn't a love match, but I believe mutual respect and kindness can make for a good partnership. Do you agree?" Cole nodded. "I do, ma'am, and I want you to know I'll work hard to be worthy of what you're offering." 3 days later, they stood before Pastor Williams in the small Clearwater church, with Sam Peterson and Mrs. Henderson as witnesses. Eleanor wore her best blue dress, and Cole had borrowed a proper suit from Sam. The ceremony was brief and practical, much like the arrangement itself. "Do you, Eleanor, take Cole to be your lawfully wedded husband, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, till death do you part?" "I do." "Do you, Cole, take Eleanor to be your lawfully wedded wife, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, till death do you part?" Cole's voice was steady. "I do." When Pastor Williams pronounced them husband and wife, Cole gave Eleanor a gentle kiss on the cheek, chaste and respectful, exactly what their arrangement called for. But Eleanor found herself noticing the warmth of his breath, the faint scent of soap and horses that clung to him. The small gathering afterward at Eleanor's house was awkward but well-meaning. Mrs. Henderson had brought a cake, and Sam Peterson offered toasts that were more enthusiastic than the circumstances strictly warranted. The townspeople who attended seemed genuinely pleased, though Eleanor could see the questions in their eyes. By evening, the guests had departed, leaving Eleanor and Cole alone in the house for the first time as husband and wife. "I've prepared the spare room for you," Eleanor said, her voice suddenly formal. "It has its own entrance from the back porch, if you prefer privacy." Cole stood in the front parlor, hat in hand, looking like he wasn't sure where to put himself. "That's very considerate, ma'am." "Mrs. Eleanor," her name felt strange on his tongue. "We should probably start your lessons tomorrow," Eleanor said. "If you're agreeable." "I am. Very much so." They stood there for a moment, two strangers who had just promised to share a life, each uncertain how to proceed. Finally, Cole cleared his throat. "Eleanor, I want you to know I meant what I said at the altar. I'll do everything I can to be a good husband to you, even if this isn't a traditional marriage." Eleanor felt something shift inside her chest at his words. "And I'll do everything I can to be a good teacher and partner to you, Cole." He smiled then, a genuine expression that transformed his weathered features. "I guess we'll figure it out as we go." That night, as Eleanor lay in her bed and listened to Cole moving quietly around the spare room, she wondered what she had started. The arrangement had seemed so logical, so practical when she'd planned it. But now, with another person in her house, everything felt different. The silence that had oppressed her for 3 years was broken, replaced by the sounds of another human being, the creak of floorboards, the soft sound of water being poured into a basin, the rustle of bedclothes. For the first time since Richard's death, Eleanor didn't feel entirely alone. It was both comforting and terrifying. In the spare room, Cole sat on the edge of the narrow bed and pulled his mother's Bible from his pocket. Tomorrow, he thought. Tomorrow, Eleanor would begin teaching him to unlock its secrets. The possibility filled him with an anticipation he hadn't felt in years. He had entered into this marriage for practical reasons, but as he settled into the unfamiliar bed in his new home, Cole found himself hoping it might become something more than either of them had bargained for. The morning after their wedding, Eleanor woke to the unfamiliar sound of someone moving quietly in her kitchen. For a moment, confusion clouded her thoughts before memory returned. Cole was here now, her husband, in name, if not in heart. She dressed quickly and found him standing awkwardly by the stove, clearly uncertain about his place in her domestic routine. "Good morning," she said, smoothing her skirts. "I hope you slept well." "Well enough, thank you." Cole gestured toward the cold stove. "I wasn't sure if I should start the fire. Didn't want to presume." Eleanor reached for her recipe book, its pages yellowed from years of use and stained with countless meals. "Please, make yourself at home. This is your house now, too." She opened the book to her mother's biscuit recipe, then paused. "Actually, would you like to help with breakfast? I could read the recipe aloud as we work." Cole's face brightened with interest. "I'd like that very much." As Eleanor read each ingredient and instruction, Cole listened intently, his calloused hands surprisingly gentle as he measured flour and milk. She found herself studying his profile as he worked the concentration in his blue eyes, the careful precision of his movements. There was an innate intelligence there that lack of education had never diminished. "My mother used to cook like this," Cole said as they worked side by side. "Never needed to measure anything, just went by feel and experience. I always wished I could read her recipes after she passed." "Perhaps we can write down some of the things you remember," Eleanor suggested. "It could be good practice for your writing lessons." Their first official reading lesson took place that afternoon at Eleanor's kitchen table, with the late sunlight streaming through gingham curtains. Eleanor had retrieved her teaching slate and a primer from the schoolhouse, along with a handful of pencils, worn short by countless students. "We'll start with the alphabet," Eleanor said, writing the letter A in careful script. "Each letter has a sound, and when we combine those sounds, they make words." Cole bent over the slate with the intensity of a man studying battle plans. His large hands dwarfed the small piece of chalk, but he gripped it carefully as Eleanor guided him through, forming each letter. When he successfully wrote his first complete alphabet, his smile was like sunrise. "I did it," he said, wonder evident in his voice. "I actually wrote the whole alphabet." "You did indeed. Tomorrow we'll start putting letters together to make simple words." The rhythm of their days began to establish itself naturally. Cole would rise before dawn to check on Eleanor's chickens and tend to the small tasks that kept the property functioning. Eleanor would prepare breakfast while Cole completed his morning chores. After he left for work at the livery stable, Eleanor would plan their evening lessons, selecting readings that would challenge but not overwhelm him. Evenings became their sacred time. After supper, they would sit at the kitchen table with the oil lamp casting golden circles of light around them. Eleanor would write words on her slate: cat, dog, house, sky, and Cole would sound them out slowly, his brow furrowed in concentration. When he successfully read a word without help, his face would light up with the same joy Eleanor had seen in countless students over the years. The townspeople's reactions to their marriage varied considerably. Mrs. Henderson at the general store was openly approving, declaring that Eleanor had made a sensible choice in marrying a man of good character. Others were more reserved, particularly some of the town's more prominent families who felt Eleanor had married beneath her station. "Don't know what she was thinking," Eleanor overheard Mrs. Carmichael whisper to her friend outside the church, a woman with her education and property, tying herself to a common laborer. But there were also unexpected sources of support. Old Martha Stevens, the town's unofficial matchmaker, cornered Eleanor at the general store with a knowing smile. "That man looks at you like you hung the moon," she said quietly. "Mark my words, this marriage of yours will surprise everyone, maybe even yourselves." Eleanor felt heat rise in her cheeks. "It's a practical arrangement, Mrs. Stevens, nothing more. If you say so, dear, but I've been watching people fall in love for 60 years, and I know the signs." Cole's progress with reading came in fits and starts. Some days, the letters seemed to dance before his eyes, refusing to form coherent words. Other days, understanding would dawn like sunrise, and whole sentences would suddenly make sense. Eleanor learned to read his moods, to know when to push forward and when to let him rest. One evening, as they worked through a particularly challenging passage about farm animals, Cole suddenly slammed his hand on the table in frustration. "This is hopeless," he said, his voice tight with anger. "I'm too old, too stupid to learn this." Eleanor reached across the table and gently placed her hand over his. "Cole Garrett, you are neither old nor stupid. You're learning something that most people master as children, and you're doing it as an adult with a lifetime of other responsibilities. That takes tremendous courage." Cole looked down at their joined hands, his expression softening. "Sometimes I feel like I'm letting you down. Like maybe you made a mistake choosing me." "I didn't make a mistake," Eleanor said firmly. "You're one of the most intelligent men I've ever met. Intelligence isn't about reading, it's about understanding, problem-solving, caring for others. You have all of those qualities in abundance." That night, Cole surprised Eleanor by fixing her loose porch step without being asked. She found him the next morning, testing the repair with his weight. "Thank you," she said. "I've been meaning to fix that for months." "It's the least I can do," Cole replied. "You're giving me something I never thought I'd have. Seems only right I should take care of things around here." As the days passed, small intimacies began to develop between them. Cole learned that Eleanor liked her coffee strong and her eggs cooked just until the whites set. Eleanor discovered that Cole had nightmares, sometimes fragments of war that still haunted his sleep, and that a gentle word or the offer of warm milk could ease him back to rest. One morning, as Eleanor prepared to leave for the schoolhouse, Cole called her name softly. "Eleanor?" When she turned, he was holding up a piece of paper with careful, childlike script. "I wrote my name, my whole name, all by myself." Looking at Cole Thomas Garrett, written in his painstaking handwriting, Eleanor felt a surge of pride and affection that surprised her with its intensity. This wasn't just academic progress, this was a man reclaiming a fundamental part of his identity. "It's beautiful, Cole," she said, and meant it. As she walked to school that morning, Eleanor found herself humming something she hadn't done since Richard's death. The arrangement was working better than she had dared hope, and not just because of Cole's progress with reading. The house felt alive again, filled with purpose and gentle companionship. She was beginning to suspect that Martha Stevens might be right about the signs. 3 weeks into their marriage, Cole achieved his first major breakthrough. Eleanor had been working with him using a child's McGuffey reader, its simple sentences and familiar words designed to build confidence. They were sitting at their usual spot at the kitchen table when Cole suddenly stopped in the middle of a passage about a farmer and his horses. "I understand it," he said, his voice filled with amazement. "I'm not just sounding out the letters, I'm actually reading the story." Eleanor looked up from her mending to see Cole staring at the page with wonder, as if the book had performed magic before his eyes. "Read it aloud to me," she suggested gently. Cole's voice was halting but clear as he read. "The farmer loved his horses. He gave them oats and hay every day. The horses worked hard in the fields. At night, they rested in the warm barn. When he finished, he looked up at Eleanor with eyes bright with accomplishment. "You did beautifully," Eleanor said, setting aside her sewing. "How does it feel?" "Like I've been blind my whole life and suddenly I can see." Cole ran his fingers over the words on the page. "All these years, all these books and letters and signs, they were full of meaning I couldn't touch." That evening, Cole shared more about his son Thomas for the first time since their wedding. They were cleaning up after supper when he mentioned casually that he'd received another letter from back east. "He writes every few months," Cole said. "Drying the dishes Eleanor washed. Always the same, telling me about his work in the textile mill, asking if I'm well. Never mentions coming home." Eleanor handed him a wet plate. "What happened between you two, if you don't mind my asking?" Cole was quiet for a long moment, concentrating on drying the plate with unnecessary thoroughness. "Thomas was 16 when the war started. Old enough to understand, but young enough to think everything was simple. He couldn't understand why I felt called to fight when we had no slaves, no personal stake in the conflict. But you went anyway." "I did. Felt it was my duty as an American citizen. Thomas saw it as abandonment, choosing strangers over family." Cole set the plate carefully in the cupboard. "When I came back, he was different, cold. Said I'd missed his growing up for a cause that had nothing to do with us." Eleanor could hear the pain in Cole's voice, carefully controlled but unmistakably present. "How long has it been since you've seen him?" 8 years. He left for the factories when he turned 21. Said there was nothing for him here but dirt and disappointment." "Perhaps if you could write to him yourself," Eleanor suggested carefully. "Tell him about learning to read, about our marriage. It might open a door." Cole considered this. "Maybe. But what if he doesn't want that door opened? Then at least you'll know you tried." As Cole's reading improved, Eleanor began sharing stories from her own teaching experiences. She told him about former students who had overcome tremendous obstacles, immigrant children who mastered English, freed slaves who learned to read despite laws that had once forbidden it, and adults who had returned to education after years of believing they were incapable of learning. "There's something magical about watching someone discover they can learn," Eleanor said one evening as they worked through a more advanced reader. "It's like watching a person realize they can fly." Cole looked up from the page he'd been reading. "Is that how you see me? Learning to fly?" The question caught Eleanor off guard with its directness. She found herself studying his face in the lamplight, the weathered features, the eyes that held both vulnerability and strength. "Yes," she said simply, "I do." Something shifted between them in that moment, a recognition that their relationship was evolving beyond their original practical arrangement. Cole reached across the table and briefly touched Eleanor's hand. "Thank you," he said, "for believing I could do this when I didn't believe it myself." The first real test of their public partnership came with the announcement of the town's annual harvest dance. Despite the drought's impact on crops, the community had decided to proceed with the tradition, perhaps because they needed celebration more than ever. Eleanor and Cole would be expected to attend as a married couple, to dance together and present themselves as a united front to the entire community. Cole's anxiety about the event was palpable. "I don't know how to dance proper," he admitted to Eleanor as they discussed the upcoming evening. "Never had much call for it." "We can practice," Eleanor offered. "It's really just moving together to music." They cleared space in the front parlor, and Eleanor hummed a simple waltz while showing Cole the basic steps. His natural grace, developed from years of working with horses, served him well. Within an hour, he was moving confidently to her humming, his large hands gentle on her waist and shoulder. "You're a natural," Eleanor said as they swayed together in the lamplight. "You have excellent rhythm." Cole smiled down at her. "Good teacher makes all the difference." As they practiced, Eleanor became aware of Cole's warmth, the solid strength of his frame, the way he smelled of soap and honest work. When the lesson ended and they stepped apart, she felt an unexpected sense of loss. The night of the dance, Eleanor wore her best dress, a deep green silk that brought out the color of her eyes. Cole had borrowed another suit from Sam Peterson and had spent considerable time ensuring his hair was properly combed and his boots polished to a shine. "You look beautiful," Cole said when Eleanor appeared in the front parlor, and the sincerity in his voice made her cheeks warm. "You look quite handsome yourself," she replied, and meant it. The town hall was decorated with late-season flowers and lit by dozens of oil lamps. The local musicians, a fiddler, a guitarist, and a man with a harmonica provided music that ranged from lively reels to gentle waltzes. Eleanor and Cole entered together, and Eleanor was pleased to note that they drew admiring rather than suspicious glances. When the first waltz began, Cole offered Eleanor his arm with courtly formality. "Mrs. Garrett, would you do me the honor?" As they moved onto the dance floor, Eleanor felt eyes upon them, but Cole's steady presence gave her confidence. He danced exactly as he'd learned, with careful attention to her comfort and natural grace that made their movements seem effortless. "The whole town is watching us," Eleanor murmured as they turned. "Let them watch," Cole replied quietly. "I'm proud to be here with you." During a break between dances, several townspeople approached them with congratulations and friendly conversation. Eleanor noticed how Cole handled the social interaction with quiet dignity and genuine interest in others. He might lack formal education, but he possessed an emotional intelligence that served him well. As the evening progressed, Eleanor found herself genuinely enjoying Cole's company. He was attentive without being possessive, social without being overwhelming. When the musicians played a particularly beautiful waltz, she closed her eyes and allowed herself to simply enjoy the moment, the music, the movement, the warmth of being held by someone who cared for her well-being. For the first time since Richard's death, Eleanor felt part of a couple again. And for the first time since their wedding, she wondered if their practical arrangement might be evolving into something deeper. The morning after the harvest dance, Eleanor woke to find a small music box on her kitchen table, a delicate porcelain ballerina that played the same waltz they had danced to the night before. Cole was nowhere to be seen, having already left for his work at the livery, but the gift spoke volumes about his thoughtfulness. When he returned that evening, Eleanor was waiting with the music box in her hands. "Where did you find this?" she asked, winding the tiny key and watching the ballerina spin to the familiar melody. Cole removed his hat and hung it carefully on the peg by the door. "Mrs. Henderson had it in the back of the store, said it belonged to her grandmother. I thought you might like it. After last night. It's beautiful, Cole. Thank you." Eleanor set the music box on the mantelpiece next to Richard's photograph. "The dance was wonderful. You were wonderful." Cole's cheeks reddened slightly at the compliment. "Felt good, being out with you like that. Like we were a real married couple." The words hung in the air between them, loaded with implications neither was quite ready to address directly. Eleanor busied herself with preparing their evening lesson, but she found her thoughts returning to the way Cole had held her during their dances, the pride in his voice when he'd introduced her to other townspeople. "Cole," she said as they settled at their usual spots at the kitchen table. "Last night, when you called me Mrs. Garrett, I noticed you used my married name for the first time." Cole looked up from the reader Eleanor had selected for him. Seemed right, somehow. "We are married, after all." "We are," Eleanor agreed softly, "even if it's not a traditional marriage." "Maybe it's becoming something close to traditional," Cole said quietly, then quickly focused his attention on the book before him. "What are we reading tonight?" Eleanor had chosen a collection of simple poems for their lesson, thinking Cole might enjoy the rhythm and imagery. As he worked his way through a piece about autumn landscapes, she found herself watching his profile in the lamplight, noting the concentration that furrowed his brow, the way his lips moved silently as he worked through unfamiliar words. "This one," Cole said suddenly, pointing to a short verse about home and belonging. "Could you read this one aloud first? I want to hear how it's supposed to sound." Eleanor read the poem in her clear, gentle voice, and Cole closed his eyes to listen. When she finished, he opened his eyes and met her gaze. "That's what this feels like," he said simply. "Home." The words hit Eleanor with unexpected force. In the months since their marriage, she had grown comfortable with Cole's presence, had come to appreciate his kindness and dedication to learning. But hearing him call her house their house home made her realize how much their relationship had already changed from the practical arrangement they had originally negotiated. That weekend brought the first real challenge to their evolving partnership. Eleanor was working in her struggling garden when Mrs. Carmichael and her daughter approached with obvious intent to gossip. "Eleanor, dear," Mrs. Carmichael began with false sweetness, "we've been wondering how you're finding married life with your unusual choice of husband." Eleanor continued weeding around her tomato plants, her movements deliberately calm. "I'm finding it very satisfactory, thank you." "Of course, but surely a woman of your education must find it difficult, living with someone so limited?" Before Eleanor could respond, Cole's voice came from behind them. "Good morning, ladies. Eleanor, Sam Peterson sent word that he's got some feed sacks you might want for the chickens." Mrs. Carmichael's eyes sharpened with malicious interest. "Mr. Garrett, how nice to see you. We were just discussing the challenges of marriage between people from such different backgrounds." Cole's expression remained perfectly polite, but Eleanor caught the slight stiffening of his shoulders. "I reckon every marriage has its challenges, ma'am. Eleanor and I are working through ours just fine." "But surely the differences in education must be quite pronounced," Mrs. Carmichael pressed. "How do you even converse about important matters?" Eleanor stood, brushing dirt from her hands, her patience finally exhausted. "Mrs. Carmichael, I've found that wisdom and intelligence have very little to do with formal education. My husband possesses both in abundance, along with kindness and integrity qualities that are apparently in shorter supply than I had previously realized." The dismissal was clear and uncompromising. Mrs. Carmichael huffed indignantly and departed with her daughter in tow. When they were gone, Eleanor turned to Cole with an apologetic expression. "I'm sorry you had to hear that." Cole shook his head. "Nothing I haven't heard before, in one form or another, but I appreciate you standing up for me." "For us, we're partners," Eleanor said firmly. "That means we defend each other." That evening, their reading lesson took on a different quality. Cole seemed more determined than usual, pushing through difficult passages with stubborn persistence. When he successfully read an entire page without help, Eleanor praised his progress enthusiastically. "You're reading at nearly a 6th grade level now," she told him. "In just 2 months, you've accomplished what most children take years to learn." Cole looked up from the book with a slight smile. "High enough level to hold my own in conversation with Mrs. Carmichael." "High enough to hold your own with anyone," Eleanor replied with conviction. As September deepened into October, the drought showed no signs of breaking. Wells throughout the territory continued to fail, and Eleanor's own water level was dropping noticeably. The vegetable garden that had once provided most of their food was now a collection of withered plants surviving on carefully rationed water. Cole had been working longer hours at the livery as desperate travelers passed through town, their animals in need of care, and their owners willing to pay premium prices for water and feed. The extra income was welcome, but it meant less time for reading lessons and household tasks. One evening, as they worked together to harvest what little remained of Eleanor's garden, Cole broke their comfortable silence. "Eleanor, I've been thinking about something." "Oh?" She looked up from the handful of small, drought-stunted carrots she'd been examining. "This arrangement of ours, it's working out better than either of us expected, isn't it?" Eleanor straightened, brushing her hands on her apron. "Yes, I believe it is. I was wondering if you'd considered making it more permanent, more real." The question hung between them like a bridge. Neither was sure they were ready to cross. Eleanor felt her heart rate quicken, but she kept her voice steady. "What exactly are you suggesting, Cole?" "I'm suggesting that maybe what we have here is worth building on. Maybe we've found something good together, something that goes beyond our original agreement." Eleanor looked at this man who had come into her life as a solution to practical problems and had somehow become so much more. His reading lessons had progressed to the point where he could help her with household accounts. His presence had transformed her lonely house into a home filled with companionship and gentle laughter. And somewhere along the way, she had begun to care for him not just as a partner or student, but as a man she was coming to love. "I'd like that," she said quietly. "I'd like that very much." Cole's smile was like sunrise, transforming his weathered features with joy and relief. "Then maybe it's time I started calling you Eleanor instead of Mrs. Whitmore, even when we're alone." "Eleanor," she repeated, testing how her name sounded in his voice when spoken with affection rather than mere respect. "Yes, I think it's time." As they worked together in the fading light, harvesting their meager crop and planning for the challenges ahead, Eleanor realized that their practical arrangement had become something neither of them had dared hope for: a genuine partnership built on mutual respect, shared goals, and growing affection. She was no longer a widow trying to survive alone, and Cole was no longer a man ashamed of his limitations. They were becoming something new together, something stronger than either could have been apart. October brought unexpected discoveries, along with the first frost. Eleanor was organizing Richard's old desk when she found Cole's attempts at letter-writing sheets of paper covered with careful, laborious script that he'd apparently been working on in private. The letters were addressed to his son Thomas, but had never been sent, each one representing Cole's struggle to find the right words to bridge 8 years of silence and hurt. "My dear son," one began, "I hope this letter finds you well. I have learned to write now, thanks to my wife Eleanor. She is a good woman who has been very patient with me. I think about you every day and wonder if you might someday want to come home for a visit." Eleanor's heart ached as she read the simple, honest words. Each letter revealed Cole's deep regret about their estrangement and his longing for reconciliation. But also evident was his uncertainty about whether Thomas would welcome contact after so many years of silence. When Cole returned from work that evening, Eleanor had the letters waiting on the kitchen table beside their usual lesson materials. "I found these while organizing Richard's desk," she said gently. "I'm sorry if I intruded on your privacy, but Cole, these are beautiful letters. Why haven't you sent them?" Cole's face reddened with embarrassment and something that might have been shame. "I've written a dozen different versions. Every time I think I'm ready to send one, I read it over and it sounds wrong. Too simple, maybe, or not enough. I don't know how to say what I need to say." Eleanor picked up the most recent attempt and read it again, noting the careful formation of each letter, the way Cole had struggled to express complex emotions with his still-developing vocabulary. "These letters are perfect because they're honest," she said. "Thomas doesn't need fancy words, Cole. He needs to hear from his father's heart." "What if he doesn't want to hear from me at all? What if I just make things worse?" Eleanor reached across the table and took Cole's weathered hand in hers. "Then at least you'll know you tried. And maybe, just maybe, he's been waiting to hear from you too." Cole was quiet for a long moment, studying their joined hands. When he looked up, his eyes held a resolve that hadn't been there before. "Will you help me write one more? One that I'll actually send this time?" They spent the next hour crafting a letter that balanced honesty with hope. Eleanor suggested phrases when Cole struggled for words, but she insisted that every sentiment come from him. The final letter was longer than his previous attempts, but maintained the simple directness that made Cole's writing so compelling. "Dear Thomas," the letter began, "I know it has been too long since we last spoke. I have married a fine woman named Eleanor, who has taught me to read and write. Learning these things has made me think about all the words I should have said to you before you left home. I was wrong to choose the war over staying with you. I thought I was doing my duty, but I see now that my first duty was to my son. I hope someday you might forgive an old man for his mistakes. If you ever want to come home, there will always be a place for you here. Your father, Cole Garrett." "It's perfect," Eleanor said as Cole finished writing the final draft in his careful script. "It says exactly what it needs to say." Cole sealed the letter with wax from Eleanor's candle, his hands trembling slightly as he pressed her seal into the warm wax. "What if he doesn't write back? Then we'll know he needs more time. But Cole, sending this letter is an act of courage. Whatever happens, you'll know you reached out with love." The next morning, Cole walked to the post office with the letter tucked carefully in his shirt pocket. Eleanor watched from her kitchen window as he hesitated at the door, then squared his shoulders and went inside. When he emerged a few minutes later, his step seemed lighter, as if he'd set down a burden he'd been carrying for years. The economic situation in Clearwater continued to deteriorate as the drought stretched into its third year. Sam Peterson approached Cole with news that cut to the heart of their security. "I'm sorry, Cole, but I'm going to have to let you go," Sam said during Cole's lunch break. "Business has dropped off so much I can barely afford to keep the stable open. I'll give you 2 weeks' notice and whatever pay I can manage." Cole received the news with the stoicism he'd learned during his military service, but Eleanor could see the worry in his eyes when he told her that evening. "We'll manage," she said firmly, though she felt her own anxiety rising. "We have the house and my teaching income, and we've been careful with our expenses." "Your teaching income isn't enough to support both of us," Cole replied. "And with the drought affecting everyone, fewer families can afford to send their children to school." Eleanor had been dreading this conversation, but she knew it was inevitable. "Cole, I have some savings from Richard's estate, enough to carry us through the winter if we're careful." Cole's face darkened. "I won't have you spending your late husband's money to support me. That's not what you signed up for when you married me. What I signed up for was a partnership," Eleanor said with gentle firmness. "Partners support each other through difficult times. Richard would have wanted his money used to help someone worthy, and you are very worthy, Cole Garrett. It doesn't feel right living off your charity." "It's not charity, it's marriage, for richer or poorer, remember?" Their first real argument erupted that night over dinner. Cole's pride warred with practical necessity, while Eleanor tried to make him understand that financial partnership was part of their arrangement. Both of them raised their voices in ways they never had before, and harsh words were spoken that neither quite meant. "Maybe this whole arrangement was a mistake," Cole said in frustration. "Maybe I should move back to the livery and find work somewhere else." "Don't you dare," Eleanor replied, her own temper flaring. "Don't you dare run away just because things got difficult. We made a commitment to each other, and I intend to honor it, even if it means supporting a man who can't even keep a job." Especially then. They went to bed that night without resolving their differences, sleeping in separate rooms with an ocean of hurt, pride, and unspoken words between them. Eleanor lay awake, listening to Cole moving restlessly in his room, wanting to go to him, but not sure how to bridge the gap their argument had created. The resolution came the next morning when Eleanor found Cole in the kitchen, making coffee with careful attention to the strength she preferred. His shoulders held the weight of a man who had spent the night wrestling with his conscience. "I'm sorry," he said without turning around. "I let my pride get the better of me." "I'm sorry too," Eleanor replied. "I shouldn't have pushed when I could see you were struggling with the idea." Cole turned to face her, and Eleanor was struck by the vulnerability in his expression. "It's hard for me, being dependent on anyone. I've been taking care of myself since I was 14. You're not dependent, Cole. You're part of a partnership. There's a difference." He nodded slowly. "I want to contribute. I need to feel like I'm earning my place here. You do contribute. Every day. You maintain the house, you help with the garden, you're learning to keep the accounts. And you've given me something I'd lost: companionship, purpose, hope for the future." Cole's smile was small but genuine. "When you put it like that, maybe I am earning my keep." "More than earning it," Eleanor assured him. That afternoon, Cole finally sent the letter to Thomas. As they walked back from the post office together, Eleanor slipped her hand into Cole's arm, a gesture of support and affection that felt natural despite their still tentative relationship. "Whatever happens with Thomas, whatever happens with work, we'll face it together," she said. Cole covered her hand with his own. "Together," he agreed. That evening, as they resumed their reading lessons with renewed commitment to their partnership, Eleanor realized that their argument had actually strengthened their relationship. They had weathered their first real crisis as a married couple and emerged with a deeper understanding of each other's fears and needs. The letter was sent, the future was uncertain, but they were no longer facing either challenge alone. 3 weeks after Cole had mailed his letter to Thomas, a response arrived that would shatter the fragile peace they had built together. Eleanor was hanging laundry when the postal clerk delivered the envelope, and she recognized immediately from Cole's expression that something was terribly wrong. "It's from Thomas," Cole said, his voice hollow as he stared at the letter in his hands. They sat together at the kitchen table as Cole opened the envelope with trembling fingers. The letter inside was longer than anything Thomas had written before, but as Cole began to read aloud, it became clear that length did not indicate warmth. "Father," the letter began, the formal address already setting a distant tone. "I received your letter about your marriage and your newfound literacy. I confess myself amazed that you would write to me now, after 8 years of silence, to share news of what can only be described as a marriage of convenience to a woman desperate enough to take in a broken-down cowboy in exchange for teaching him his letters." Cole's voice faltered, but Eleanor gestured for him to continue. "Your letter speaks of regret and mistakes, but I wonder if you truly understand the magnitude of what you abandoned when you chose to march off to war. Mother died while you were playing soldier, and I was left alone to bury her and try to save a ranch that was already failing. I was 17 years old, Father, and you weren't there." Eleanor watched Cole's face crumble as he read the accusations that cut to the heart of his deepest regrets. But Thomas wasn't finished. "Now you write to tell me about your wife and your reading lessons, as if literacy can somehow erase the years of neglect and abandonment. But most offensive of all is your assumption that I would want to return to a place that holds nothing but painful memories, to reconnect with a father who has clearly found it convenient to replace his real family with a purchased one." Cole's hands were shaking so badly he could barely hold the letter steady. Eleanor gently took it from him and continued reading the final, devastating paragraph. "I am coming to Clearwater in 2 weeks, not for a reunion, but to settle this matter once and for all. I intend to see for myself what kind of woman would enter into such an arrangement, and to make it clear to both of you that your marriage is an insult to my mother's memory. After that, I expect never to hear from you again. Thomas Garrett." The silence that followed was deafening. Cole sat with his head in his hands, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Eleanor felt her own heart breaking, not just for Cole's pain, but for the realization that their happiness had been built on foundations that Thomas clearly considered false. "He's right," Cole whispered finally. "He's right about everything. I did abandon him. I did choose the war over my family. And now I've forced you into a situation where you'll have to face the anger I created." Eleanor reached for Cole's hands, pulling them away from his face so she could look into his eyes. Cole Garrett, listen to me. You made mistakes, yes. But you've spent the past 3 months proving that you're not the same man who made those mistakes. You've worked to better yourself, to become worthy of love and respect. But what about Thomas? What about what he said about our marriage? Eleanor felt a flash of anger on Cole's behalf. What about it? We entered into this arrangement freely, for reasons that made sense to both of us. We've built something good together, something that has brought us both happiness and growth. Thomas may not understand it, but that doesn't make it false or wrong. Cole looked up at her with eyes full of pain and something that might have been hope. You really believe that? I believe it with all my heart, and when Thomas arrives, I intend to tell him exactly that. Eleanor, maybe I should leave before he gets here, spare you from having to deal with his anger. Don't you dare. Eleanor's voice carried a steel that surprised them both. We are married, Cole. That means we face difficulties together. If Thomas wants to challenge our marriage, he'll have to deal with both of us. That night, Cole couldn't sleep. Eleanor heard him moving restlessly in his room and finally knocked softly on his door. Cole, may I come in? She found him sitting on the edge of his bed, still fully dressed, staring at Thomas's letter in his hands. The room was lit only by moonlight, streaming through the small window, casting everything in silver and shadow. I keep reading it, hoping the words will change, he said without looking up. Eleanor sat beside him on the narrow bed, close enough to feel his warmth, but careful not to presume too much intimacy. The words won't change, but their power over you can. How can you say that? He's my son, Eleanor, the only family I have left. No, Eleanor said firmly. I'm your family now too, and sometimes family means choosing to love someone even when they can't love you back the way you need them to. Cole turned to look at her, and in the moonlight she could see the tracks of tears on his weathered cheeks. I don't know how to face him, how to defend what we have, when part of me wonders if he's right. Eleanor felt something shift inside her chest, a clarity about her feelings that she'd been avoiding for weeks. Cole, what we have isn't a marriage of convenience anymore. At least, not for me. What do you mean? Eleanor took a deep breath, gathering courage for words she'd never thought she'd say again. I mean, I've fallen in love with you, not with the arrangement, not with the practical benefits with you. The man who fixes my porch steps without being asked, who listens to my stories about difficult students with genuine interest, who writes letters to his son, even when it breaks his heart to do so. Cole stared at her in the moonlight, and Eleanor rushed on before she could lose her nerve. I know this wasn't part of our original agreement. I know you married me for security and literacy lessons, not for love. But I needed you to know, before Thomas arrives and tries to tear down what we've built, that what I feel for you is real. Cole was quiet for so long that Eleanor began to wonder if she'd made a terrible mistake. Then he reached out and cupped her face in his calloused hands. Eleanor, he said, his voice rough with emotion, I've been in love with you since the night you helped me write my name for the first time. I just didn't think I had the right to say so. When he kissed her, it was nothing like the chaste peck they'd shared at their wedding ceremony. This was a kiss full of months of suppressed longing, of gratitude and affection and genuine passion. Eleanor melted into it, her hands fisting in his shirt as she kissed him back with equal fervor. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard. Cole rested his forehead against hers, his hands still cradling her face. So when Thomas comes, he said quietly, we'll face him together, as husband and wife who chose each other not just once, but again and again, every day. Together, Eleanor agreed. And Cole, don't let his anger make you forget how far you've come. You're not the same man who left for war 30 years ago. You're not even the same man who married me 4 months ago. You're someone worthy of love mine, and hopefully someday. Cole pulled her close, holding her against his chest as if she might disappear. I love you, Eleanor Garrett. I love you too, Cole Garrett. They held each other in the moonlight, two people who had found unexpected love in the midst of practical arrangements and harsh circumstances. In 2 weeks, Thomas would arrive with his anger and accusations. But tonight, they had each other, and the knowledge that what they'd built together was strong enough to weather whatever storms lay ahead. The letter from Thomas had been meant to destroy their confidence in their marriage. Instead, it had forced them to acknowledge what they'd been afraid to admit, that their arranged marriage had become a love match, and they were prepared to fight for it. The 2 weeks before Thomas's arrival passed in a blur of preparation and growing tension. Cole threw himself into reading with renewed determination, as if literacy might serve as armor against his son's accusations. Eleanor found herself cleaning house with obsessive attention to detail, wanting everything to be perfect when Thomas arrived to judge their life together. On a grey November morning, Cole revealed something to Eleanor that he had never shared with anyone. They were sitting at their usual spot for morning coffee when he pulled a small object from his shirt pocket, a tarnished bronze medal on a faded ribbon. "I want you to see this," he said, placing the medal on the table between them. "It's from the war, a medal for valor, they called it." Eleanor picked up the medal carefully, noting the weight of it, the way the bronze had darkened with age and handling. "You've never mentioned this before." "I've been ashamed of it," Cole admitted. "Seems wrong to have a medal for courage when I abandoned my son to get it." "Tell me what happened." Cole was quiet for a long moment, his fingers working the handle of his coffee cup. "It was at Antietam, September of '62. Our unit was pinned down by Confederate artillery, and there were wounded men trapped in the open. The captain called for volunteers to go get them. Eleanor waited, sensing this was a story Cole had never told in full. "I went. Brought back 3 wounded soldiers under fire. They said it was brave, gave me this medal. But all I could think about was Thomas back home, wondering why his father was risking his life for strangers when he had a son who needed him." "You saved 3 men's lives, Cole, and maybe lost my son's love in the process." Cole took the medal back from Eleanor, his thumb rubbing across its surface. "I keep it to remind me of the choice I made. Thomas is right to be angry." Eleanor reached across the table and stilled his restless hands. "You were serving your country, Cole. That doesn't make you a bad father. Doesn't make me a good one either." That afternoon, word came that Thomas had arrived in Clearwater and was staying at the boarding house on the other side of town. Mrs. Henderson brought the news when she stopped by to borrow Eleanor's large mixing bowl for a church social. "Handsome young man," she reported, with the enthusiasm of someone who lived for interesting developments. "Looks just like Cole did at that age, but dressed like city folk. Asked directions to your house, but said he'd come by tomorrow." After Mrs. Henderson left, Eleanor found Cole standing at the front window, staring out at the empty street, as if expecting Thomas to appear at any moment. "He's giving us one more night," Cole said without turning around. "Maybe working up his courage, or maybe just wanting to make us sweat. Are you nervous?" Cole laughed, but there was no humor in it. "I've faced Confederate artillery and angry bulls and drunk cowboys looking for a fight, but the thought of facing my son has me shaking like a leaf." That evening, Eleanor suggested they practice what they might say to Thomas, but Cole couldn't concentrate on the words. Instead, they found themselves talking about their own relationship, how it had grown from practicality to genuine affection to love. "Do you think we would have found each other if circumstances had been different?" Eleanor asked, as they sat by the fire after supper. "I don't know," Cole replied honestly. "Maybe I would have been too proud to approach a woman like you under normal circumstances. Maybe you would have looked right through a cowboy like me." "I don't think so. I think I would have seen what I see now, a good man with a gentle heart." Cole pulled Eleanor closer on the small sofa they'd taken to sharing for their evening conversations. "Whatever happens tomorrow, I want you to know that these past months have been the happiest of my life. You gave me more than literacy, Eleanor. You gave me hope. You gave me purpose again," Eleanor replied, "and love when I thought I was too old for such foolishness." They made love that night for the first time, their union tender and passionate, and full of the desperate intensity of two people who had found each other late in life and were determined to treasure what time they had together. Afterward, as they lay entwined in Eleanor's bed, Cole whispered words of love and gratitude that brought tears to her eyes. "Whatever Thomas says tomorrow," Eleanor said into the darkness, "remember that you are loved, completely and without reservation." The next morning dawned cold and clear, with the sharp brightness that often preceded winter storms. Eleanor and Cole went through their usual morning routine, but tension crackled between them like electricity before lightning. Cole shaved with extra care and put on his best shirt. Eleanor wore her most respectable dress and pinned her hair in a style that emphasized her dignity and maturity. They were just finishing breakfast when the knock came at the front door. 3 sharp raps, confident and demanding. Cole and Eleanor looked at each other across the kitchen table, and Eleanor saw her own determination reflected in his eyes. "Ready?" she asked. "As I'll ever be." Thomas Garrett stood on their front porch like a younger, more polished version of his father. He had Cole's height and broad shoulders, but his clothes were expensive, and his posture carried the confidence of a man who had made his way in the world through his own efforts. His resemblance to Cole was striking, but where Cole's eyes held warmth and vulnerability, Thomas's were hard, with barely contained anger. "Father," he said with formal coolness when Cole opened the door. "Thomas." Cole's voice was steady, but Eleanor could see the slight tremor in his hands. "Thank you for coming. This is my wife, Eleanor." Thomas's gaze shifted to Eleanor, and she felt herself being assessed and judged in that single look. "Mrs. Garrett," he said with perfunctory politeness that barely masked his contempt. "Please, come in," Eleanor said, her voice warm despite the hostility radiating from their visitor. "I'll make coffee." The 3 of them sat in Eleanor's front parlor, the silence stretching uncomfortably as Thomas studied the room with calculating eyes. Eleanor noticed him taking note of the books on the shelves, the quality of the furniture, the small luxuries that marked her as a woman of modest means rather than desperate poverty. "This is a fine house," Thomas said finally, his tone suggesting this was somehow an indictment rather than a compliment. "Eleanor's late husband left it to her," Cole said quietly. "She's been generous enough to share it with me." "I'm sure she has." Thomas's words carried an edge that made Eleanor's temper flare, but she kept her expression neutral. "Thomas," Cole began, "I know you're angry." "Angry?" Thomas interrupted, his careful composure finally cracking. "Father, I'm not angry. I'm ashamed. Ashamed that my father has reduced himself to this accepting charity from a stranger in exchange for basic education that any child possesses." Eleanor felt Cole flinch beside her, but she kept her voice level when she spoke. "Mr. Garrett, with respect, you don't know anything about our arrangement or our relationship. Perhaps you should hear the full story before passing judgment." Thomas turned his attention to Eleanor, and she saw Cole's intelligence in his eyes, sharpened by years of urban sophistication. "Oh, I'd very much like to hear the full story, Mrs. Garrett. Please, enlighten me about this touching romance between a desperate widow and an illiterate cowboy." The words were calculated to wound, and Eleanor saw them hit their target as Cole's shoulders sagged slightly. But she also saw something else in Cole's expression, a quiet dignity that Thomas's cruelty couldn't touch. "Thomas," Cole said, his voice carrying new strength, "you have every right to be angry with me. I made mistakes as your father, terrible mistakes that I'll regret for the rest of my life. But Eleanor has done nothing to deserve your disrespect. Hasn't she?" Thomas stood and began pacing the small parlor like a lawyer making his case. "She took advantage of a man in desperate circumstances, offered him shelter and basic education in exchange for the respectability of marriage. How is that different from any other business transaction?" Eleanor had heard enough. She rose from her chair, her own composure finally slipping. "Garrett, you are a guest in my home, but that doesn't give you the right to insult either my character or your father's." Our marriage may have begun as a practical arrangement, but it has become something far more meaningful. Has it? Or are you simply trying to justify taking advantage of my father's circumstances? That's enough, Thomas. Cole's voice carried an authority that Eleanor had never heard before, the voice of a man who had led soldiers into battle and commanded respect through courage rather than volume. You want to tear into me, fine. I probably deserve it. But I won't let you attack Eleanor for showing me kindness when no one else would. Thomas stopped pacing and stared at his father, surprise flickering across his features. For a moment, the angry young man disappeared, and Eleanor caught a glimpse of the lost boy who had watched his father ride away to war. "She's teaching you to read," Thomas said, his voice suddenly smaller. "At your age." "She is. And I can write now too. I wrote you that letter myself, every word. Why now? Why didn't you learn before?" Cole was quiet for a moment, considering his answer. "Because I was too proud to admit I needed help. Too ashamed to let anyone see my weakness." Eleanor saw past that shame to something worth saving. Thomas sank back into his chair, and Eleanor realized this confrontation was taking a different turn than any of them had expected. The anger was still there, but underneath it was something raw pain that had been festering for 8 years. "You left us," Thomas said, and suddenly he sounded like the 17-year-old boy he'd been when his father went to war. "Mother was dying, and you left us to go play soldier." Cole's eyes filled with tears, but his voice remained steady. "I know, son. I know I did. And I'm sorry, sorrier than you'll ever know." The room fell silent, except for the ticking of Eleanor's mantelpiece clock. 3 people who loved each other but didn't know how to bridge the gaps created by time and hurt and pride. Eleanor realized this was the moment that would determine not just her future with Cole, but whether this fractured family could ever hope to heal. In the heavy silence that followed Thomas's broken words, Eleanor made a decision that would change everything. She rose from her chair and walked to the desk where she kept her most important papers, including the deed to the land that had been her security and independence. As she pulled out the worn document, both men watched her with confusion. "This is my family's land deed," Eleanor said, returning to her seat and placing the paper on the small table between them. "4 generations of my family have lived on this property. It's been my anchor through every difficulty, my proof that I belong somewhere." Thomas looked puzzled by this apparent non sequitur, but Cole's eyes held understanding and growing concern. "Eleanor, what are you doing?" Cole asked quietly. "I'm trying to help Thomas understand what family really means," Eleanor replied, keeping her eyes on Thomas. "You see, Mr. Garrett, this land could have remained in my family for generations to come. I could have lived here alone, treasuring my independence and my memories. But instead, I chose to share it with your father, not because I was desperate or taking advantage, but because I recognized something in him that was worth preserving." She turned the deed so Thomas could see the careful script that documented her family's legacy. "Your father didn't ask me for anything, Thomas. I approached him. I made the proposal because I saw a good man who deserved better than what life had given him." Thomas picked up the deed, studying it with the careful attention of someone who understood the value of property and legal documents. "This is worth a considerable sum," he said slowly. "It is, and when your father and I are gone, it will pass to our heirs, which now includes you, whether you want it or not." The words hung in the air like a bridge offered across an impossible chasm. Thomas looked up sharply, meeting Eleanor's steady gaze. "Why would you do that? You don't even know me." "Because you're Cole's son, and I love Cole." "Because family isn't just about blood, it's about choosing to care for each other, even when it's difficult." Thomas was quiet for a long moment, his fingers tracing the edges of the deed. When he looked up, some of the hardness had left his expression. "He really wrote that letter himself." "Every word," Eleanor confirmed. "It took him 3 hours and 5 drafts, but he insisted on doing it himself." 9. "I taught myself to read when I was 5, Thomas said, and Eleanor heard the first note of something other than anger in his voice. "Mother helped, but mostly I figured it out on my own. I thought everyone could do it. Your father can do it too now. He's been reading to me from the Bible every evening. Would you like to hear him?" Cole's eyes widened with surprise and what might have been panic. "Eleanor, I don't think—" "Please, Cole, let Thomas see what you've accomplished." With hands that trembled slightly, Cole retrieved his mother's worn Bible from the mantelpiece. He opened to a passage he had marked with a ribbon, Psalm 23, which had been his first complete reading success. "The Lord is my shepherd," Cole began, his voice gaining strength as he continued. "I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters." As Cole read, Eleanor watched Thomas's face transform. The angry skepticism gradually gave way to amazement, then to something that might have been pride. When Cole finished the passage, Thomas was staring at his father with new eyes. "You really couldn't read before?" Thomas asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Not a word," Cole admitted. "Always felt ashamed of it, but I convinced myself it was too late to learn. But you learned anyway." "Eleanor never made me feel stupid for not knowing. She just made me feel like I could do better." Thomas turned to Eleanor, and she saw the boy he had once been before pain had hardened him into the bitter young man who had arrived on their doorstep. "I owe you an apology, Mrs. Garrett. I came here expecting to find someone taking advantage of my father's circumstances. Instead, I find someone who saw his potential when he couldn't see it himself." Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes. "You don't owe me anything, Thomas, but you might consider giving your father a chance to explain why he made the choices he did." Thomas looked at Cole, really looked at him, perhaps for the first time since arriving. "The war. Why did you really go?" Cole was quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully. "Because I believed it was the right thing to do. Because I thought if I didn't stand up for what I believed in, I wouldn't be able to look at myself in the mirror. But also because I was young and foolish and didn't understand that my first responsibility was to my family. Mother needed you. I know, and I failed her, and I failed you. I can't change that, Thomas, but I can try to do better now, if you'll let me." Thomas studied his father's face, and Eleanor held her breath, waiting for the verdict that would determine whether this family could find its way back to each other. The moment stretched between father and son like a held breath, 8 years of hurt and misunderstanding balanced on the edge of possible forgiveness. Eleanor remained silent, sensing that this reconciliation needed to happen between Cole and Thomas without her interference. Finally, Thomas spoke, his voice thick with emotion he'd been holding back for years. "I was so angry when you left. Mother tried to explain about duty and honor, but all I could see was that you were choosing strangers over us." He paused, struggling with words that had been locked inside him for too long. "When she got sick and you weren't there, I hated you for that." Cole's face crumpled with pain, but he didn't look away from his son's anguished expression. "I should have been there. That's a regret I'll carry to my grave. But the worst part," Thomas continued, his voice breaking, "was that even after I hated you, I still wanted you to come home. Every day for months after the funeral, I watched the road, hoping you'd appear. When you finally did come back, I was too proud to tell you how much I'd missed you." Eleanor wiped tears from her cheeks as she watched Cole rise from his chair and move slowly toward his son. Thomas didn't pull away when Cole knelt beside his chair, bringing them to eye level. "I missed you too, son, every single day. I thought about coming home 100 times, but I was afraid you'd tell me to leave again. I was afraid you didn't want to be my father anymore. Thomas, look at me." Cole waited until his son met his eyes. "You are the best thing I ever did in this world. The proudest moment of my life wasn't winning any medal. It was the day you were born, and I held you in my arms for the first time." The dam finally broke. Thomas threw his arms around his father, and both men wept openly for the years they'd lost, the words they'd never said, the love that had never died despite their stubborn pride. Eleanor slipped quietly from the room, giving them privacy for their reconciliation. She busied herself in the kitchen, preparing a proper meal for 3 people and trying to process the emotional upheaval of the past hour. When Cole appeared in the doorway 20 minutes later, his eyes were red but peaceful. "How are you both doing?" Eleanor asked, wiping her hands on her apron. "Better, much better." Cole crossed to where she stood and pulled her into his arms. "Thank you for everything you said, everything you did. You saved us, Eleanor. You saved yourselves. I just provided a safe place for it to happen." Thomas appeared behind his father, looking younger than his 29 years and slightly embarrassed by his emotional display. "Mrs. Garrett Eleanor, I owe you a tremendous debt. You not only helped my father become the man he was meant to be, you helped me find him again." Eleanor smiled warmly at this young man who was becoming family before her eyes. "You don't owe me anything, Thomas, but I hope you'll stay for supper. I've made enough for 3. I'd like that very much." As they worked together to prepare the meal, Thomas shared stories of his life in the textile mills, his struggles to establish himself in an industrial world so different from the frontier life he'd known. Eleanor watched father and son discover each other as adults, finding common ground in their shared experiences of hard work and perseverance. "I've thought about coming back to Wyoming," Thomas admitted as they sat down to Eleanor's roast beef and potatoes. "The mills are dangerous work, and there's no real future in it for someone like me. But I didn't think I had anywhere to come home to." Cole looked up from his plate, hope flickering in his eyes. "You'd always have a place here, son. Always." "What would I do for work? The ranch is gone, and I don't know anything but factory work now." Eleanor set down her fork and looked thoughtfully at Thomas. "Actually, Clearwater could use someone with your skills. Henderson has been talking about bringing some small manufacturing to town, simple textile work that could employ local women. Someone with your experience could help set that up." "And there's always need for good men who aren't afraid of hard work," Cole added. "Sam Peterson might be looking for help again if business picks up." Thomas nodded slowly, considering the possibilities. "I could try it for a while. See how it goes. I've saved some money from the mills." "You could stay here while you get established," Eleanor offered. "We have that spare room upstairs that's not being used." The offer surprised both men, and Eleanor saw Thomas struggle with whether to accept what might seem like charity. "I'd pay rent, of course," Thomas said carefully. "We're family now," Eleanor replied firmly. "Family helps each other." After supper, they sat around the kitchen table with Cole's Bible open before them. At Eleanor's suggestion, Cole read aloud the story of the prodigal son, his voice steady and clear as he navigated the familiar words. When he finished, Thomas shook his head in amazement. "I still can't believe you learned to read at your age. It must have been incredibly difficult." "Eleanor made it seem possible," Cole said, reaching for his wife's hand. "She never lost patience, never made me feel foolish for struggling." "That's what good teachers do," Thomas said, looking at Eleanor with new respect. "They see potential where others see limitations." As the evening drew to a close, Thomas surprised them both by producing a small package from his traveling bag. "I brought this for Father," he said, placing a new Bible on the table. I thought maybe it was time he had one he could actually read." Cole picked up the book with reverent hands, running his fingers over the tooled leather cover and the gold lettering of his name embossed on the front. "Thomas, this is beautiful. Thank you. I had it made specially. The print is larger than usual, easier to read." Eleanor watched the exchange with a full heart, seeing how this simple gift represented so much more than a book. It was Thomas's acceptance of his father's transformation and his faith in their renewed relationship. "I'll treasure it," Cole said, his voice thick with emotion. When Thomas finally prepared to leave for his boarding house, the atmosphere was completely different than when he had arrived. Father and son embraced warmly, and Thomas kissed Eleanor's cheek with genuine affection. "I'll come by tomorrow," Thomas promised. "Maybe you could show me around town, help me get a sense of what opportunities might be available." "I'd like that very much," Cole replied. After Thomas left, Eleanor and Cole sat together on their front porch, despite the November chill, watching the stars emerge in the clear night sky. "I can hardly believe it," Cole said, his arm around Eleanor's shoulders. "This morning I thought I'd lost my son forever. Tonight he's talking about coming home. He never stopped loving you, Cole. He was just hurt and didn't know how to bridge the gap. None of this would have happened without you. You gave me the courage to reach out to him, the skills to write that letter, and the wisdom to handle his anger with grace." Eleanor leaned against Cole's solid warmth, feeling complete in a way she hadn't since Richard's death. "We gave each other what we needed. That's what love does. It transforms people and circumstances in ways we never expect. Do you think he'll really stay? Really come home?" Eleanor smiled up at her husband, seeing the hope and love shining in his eyes. "I think Thomas Garrett is ready to discover that home isn't a place, it's the people who love you unconditionally, no matter how long you've been away or how much you've changed." Cole pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "Then he's definitely found his way home." 6 months later, on a warm spring morning that promised relief from the long drought, Eleanor stood in her kitchen preparing breakfast for 3 people, a routine that had become as natural as breathing. The coffee was stronger now, the way both Cole and Thomas preferred it, and the eggs were scrambled loose and fluffy, just as Cole had taught her his mother used to make them. Through the window, she could see Cole and Thomas working together to repair the chicken coop that winter storms had damaged. Their easy collaboration spoke of months of rebuilding trust, of discovering that the relationship between father and son could be different than what they'd known before, deeper, more honest, built on mutual respect rather than obligation. Thomas had indeed stayed in Clearwater, and his presence had transformed not just their household, but their entire community. The small textile operation he'd helped establish was providing work for a dozen local women, and his practical knowledge of manufacturing had made him a valued voice in town planning meetings. He'd rented rooms above the general store but took most of his meals with Cole and Eleanor, creating the family dynamic none of them had dared hope for. Eleanor smiled as she watched Cole demonstrate the proper way to nail boards without splitting the wood, his patient teaching manner evident even in carpentry. Thomas listened with the attention of someone who valued every piece of wisdom his father shared, making up for years when pride had kept them apart. "Morning, Eleanor," Thomas called as he and Cole approached the back door, their faces flushed from honest work and their clothes dusty from handling lumber. "Something smells wonderful. Fresh biscuits and that honey Mrs. Stevens brought by yesterday," Eleanor replied, wiping her hands on her apron. "Wash up and I'll have everything ready." As they settled around the kitchen table that had become the heart of their home, Eleanor marveled at how naturally they'd all adapted to their expanded family. Cole still helped with the cooking, Thomas had taken over most of the heavy maintenance work, and Eleanor continued her teaching while also managing the household finances with Cole's increasingly sophisticated help. "I got a letter from the Territorial Education Department," Eleanor announced as she passed the biscuits. "They're offering me a position as district supervisor, overseeing schools in 5 counties. Both men looked up with interest and concern. The position would mean considerable travel and responsibility, but also recognition of Eleanor's expertise and dedication to education. "That's a tremendous honor," Thomas said. "You'd be one of the first women to hold such a position in the territory." "It would mean being away from home quite a bit," Eleanor said, watching Cole's face for his reaction. "You should take it," Cole said without hesitation. "It's exactly the kind of work you were meant to do. Thomas and I can manage things here just fine." Eleanor felt a warm rush of gratitude for this man, who had never once tried to limit her ambitions or make her choose between love and professional fulfillment. "Are you certain it would mean changes for all of us?" "The best changes are the ones that help people grow into who they're meant to be," Cole replied. "You helped me discover I could learn to read and write. Now it's time for you to discover how far your own gifts can take you." After breakfast, as Thomas headed to town for his work at the textile operation, Cole and Eleanor walked together through Eleanor's garden, now thriving thanks to the return of regular rainfall. The drought had finally broken in February, and the spring planting had been their most successful in years. "I have something for you," Cole said, as they paused beside the tomato plants that were already showing tiny green fruits. From his pocket, he pulled a small velvet box that made Eleanor's breath catch. "Cole, what is this?" "Open it and see." Inside the box was a beautiful gold ring set with a small but perfect emerald, clearly chosen with care and love. Eleanor looked up to find Cole watching her with an expression of nervous hope. "It's a real wedding ring," he said, "to replace the plain band from our practical marriage. I thought maybe it was time we had a real ceremony too, one that celebrates what we've actually built together." Eleanor's eyes filled with tears as she looked at the ring that represented so much more than jewelry. "Cole, but we're already married." "We had a legal ceremony," Cole corrected gently. "But I'd like us to have a ceremony that celebrates love, not just convenience. Will you marry me again, Eleanor, this time for all the right reasons?" Eleanor threw her arms around Cole's neck, the ring box pressed between them as she kissed him with all the joy and love that filled her heart. "Yes, of course, yes. I'd marry you 100 times over." The second wedding took place on a perfect June afternoon in Eleanor's garden, with the entire community of Clearwater in attendance. Thomas walked Eleanor down the makeshift aisle, giving her away with tears of joy in his eyes. Cole wore a new suit that Eleanor had insisted on buying him, and Eleanor wore a dress the color of spring sky that Thomas had helped her select during a trip to the larger town 40 miles away. Pastor Williams performed the ceremony with obvious pleasure, having watched their practical arrangement blossom into genuine love over the course of a year. When he pronounced them husband and wife, Cole and Eleanor kissed with the passion of lovers and the tenderness of best friends, while their community celebrated the kind of love story that gave everyone hope. At the reception that followed, Cole surprised everyone by reading aloud a poem he had written for Eleanor, his voice clear and confident as he shared words of love and gratitude that brought tears to many eyes. Eleanor responded with her own speech, thanking the community for embracing their unconventional beginning and celebrating the way love could grow in the most unexpected soil. As the evening wound down and their guests began to depart, Eleanor, Cole, and Thomas stood together on the front porch, watching the sunset paint the Wyoming sky in shades of gold and rose. "I never imagined this," Thomas said quietly. "When I came here 6 months ago, I thought I was going to destroy something false. Instead, I found something more real than anything I'd ever known." Eleanor took Thomas's hand and squeezed it gently. "Family isn't about perfection, Thomas. It's about showing up for each other again and again until love becomes stronger than any mistake we've made." Cole wrapped his arms around both of them, and Eleanor felt the profound satisfaction of a woman who had found her place in the world. She had her work challenging and meaningful and respected. She had her love deep and tested and true, and she had her family chosen and cherished and complete. As stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Eleanor reflected on the journey that had brought them all to this moment. Sometimes the best love stories really did begin with the most practical proposals, growing slowly and surely until they became something beautiful enough to last a lifetime.